1 week before her 96th birthday, my grandmother Evelyn Cooper made a single quiet request that should have been simple. "Audrey, can you take me to see the ocean one last time?" Her voice was thin, almost lost in the sterile air of the living room. My father Richard let out a short, bitter laugh. "Mom won't remember any of it tomorrow," he said, waving his hand like he was brushing away a fly. The trip was canceled on the spot. No one wanted to waste an entire day on a woman whose mind was slipping away. No one except me. I put on my dress uniform, climbed into the car, and drove more than 3 hours to give her that one last look at the waves. I had no idea that single afternoon would tear our family apart and force every one of us to face the truth we'd been hiding from for years. The coastal highway stretched out like a gray ribbon under the late morning sun as I gripped the steering wheel with steady hands. Captain Audrey Cooper, U.S. Army, home on leave after another long deployment. At 38, I had spent most of my adult life in places where the rules were clear and duty came first. Coming home to Oregon always felt like stepping back into a fog I could never quite navigate. My family saw me as the too serious one, the daughter who asked too many questions and expected too much. But Evelyn, my grandmother, had always looked at me differently. Even as her memory began to fray like old cloth, she still lit up when I walked into the room. I pulled into the driveway of the modest craftsman house where she had lived for over 60 years. The paint was peeling now. The rose bushes my grandfather once tended with such care had grown wild. Richard's silver SUV was already parked at the curb. He stood on the porch with his arms crossed, checking his watch. My mother Linda hovered behind him, her face tight with the kind of practiced patience she had perfected over decades of marriage. My older brother Jason leaned against the railing, scrolling through his phone, barely looking up. "You're really doing this?" Richard asked as I helped Evelyn down the front steps. She moved slowly, her small frame wrapped in a soft blue cardigan that smelled faintly of lavender and the peppermint candies she always kept in her pocket. "Yes, Dad," she asked. "I'm taking her." He shook his head, the same dismissive gesture I had seen 100 times growing up. "She won't remember it, Audrey. You're just going to exhaust yourself and her. We have the birthday party to plan. There's a lot to organize." Linda touched his arm gently. "Richard's right, honey. The doctor said her good days are getting fewer." "Why put her through the drive?" Jason finally glanced up. "It's a nice thought, sis, but you know how this goes. Last month she thought I was Dad half the time." Evelyn's hand tightened on my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Audrey knows," she said softly, her voice carrying that familiar warmth that cut through the tension like sunlight through clouds. "My brave girl always knows." I felt a familiar ache in my chest. For as long as I could remember, Evelyn had been my anchor. When I was a quiet, bookish child who preferred the company of stories to the chaos of family gatherings, she would sit with me on the back porch and tell tales of her own youth, how she met my grandfather during the war, how they built this house with their own hands. Even now, as Alzheimer's stole pieces of her day by day, she still remembered me. She remembered the way I took my coffee, the scar on my left knee from a childhood bike accident, the fact that I had always been afraid of thunderstorms. The rest of the family had slowly pulled away. Richard visited mostly when there were papers to sign or when the lawyer called about the house and the accounts. He was a successful real estate developer, always chasing the next deal, always too busy to sit with his mother for more than 20 minutes. Linda followed his lead, offering cheerful but empty visits filled with small talk about the weather. Jason, busy with his own family and tech job in Portland, sent flowers on holidays and called it good. I loaded Evelyn carefully into the passenger seat of my rented SUV, adjusting the pillow behind her back and making sure her seatbelt was comfortable. As I pulled away from the house, I caught Richard's reflection in the rearview mirror, his jaw-tight eyes narrowed in that familiar mix of irritation and something deeper I couldn't quite name. The drive was long, but Evelyn seemed content. She watched the trees blur past the window, humming fragments of old hymns under her breath. Every so often she would point out something familiar, a red barn she remembered from childhood trips, the curve of the river where my grandfather once took her fishing. Her memories came in bright flashes like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds before slipping away again. When we finally reached the coast, the air changed. The sharp, salty tang of the ocean filled the car as I rolled down the windows. Evelyn's eyes widened. "Oh, Audrey," she whispered. "It's still here." I found a quiet spot near the beach. Access helped her into a wheelchair I had borrowed, and pushed her along the boardwalk until we reached a bench overlooking the Pacific. The waves rolled in with a steady rhythm crashing against the sand in white foam. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the wind. Evelyn tilted her face toward the sun, breathing deeply. For the first time in months, she looked completely at peace. We sat together for hours. I bought us ice cream cones from a nearby stand, strawberry for her, vanilla for me. She licked at it slowly, a small smile playing on her lips, as a bit of it dripped onto her sweater. She didn't seem to mind. We watched the birds listen to the surf and spoke in the easy rhythm we had always shared. Sometimes her words wandered, mixing up names or times, but then she would look at me with startling clarity. "You've been gone so long this time," she said at one point, her hand resting on mine. "But you always come back. That's what matters." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of every missed holiday, every extra deployment I had volunteered for just to avoid the slow unraveling happening at home. "I'm here now, Grandma." A kind stranger walking by noticed us and offered to take a photo. Evelyn surprised me by asking him to record a short video instead. Just a little something, she said with a mischievous glint in her eye. "For later." The man smiled and obliged filming for a few minutes before handing my phone back. "She wanted this kept safe," he told me quietly as he walked away. As the afternoon light turned golden, Evelyn stared out at the endless horizon. The wind tugged gently at her silver hair. She was quiet for a long time, longer than usual. Then she spoke, her voice steady and sure. "Now I'm ready." I didn't fully understand what she meant then. I simply held her hand, feeling the thin skin and fragile bones, and watched the waves with her until the sun began to sink. The drive home was quiet, Evelyn dozing peacefully beside me. I had no way of knowing that this single day by the ocean had set in motion something none of us could stop. The salt air hit us the moment I opened the car door at the coastal overlook. Evelyn stirred beside me, her eyes fluttering open as if waking from a long dream. For a moment she looked confused, her thin brows drawing together, but then the sound of the waves reached her and everything shifted. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face, the kind I hadn't seen in years. "We made it," she whispered, squeezing my hand with surprising strength. "You brought me back." I wheeled her carefully down the accessible path toward the bench I had spotted earlier, the wheels crunching softly over damp sand and scattered shells. The Pacific stretched out before us, vast and restless, its surface glittering under the midday sun. 30 years had passed since Evelyn last stood on this shore. My grandfather had been gone nearly that long, and the family trips that once filled our summers had faded into memory. Today it was just the two of us. We settled onto the weathered wooden bench, the sun warm on our shoulders, despite the cool breeze coming off the water. I wrapped a light blanket around her legs and handed her a strawberry ice cream cone I had picked up from the small stand near the parking lot. She took it with both hands like a child, licking slowly, savoring the sweetness as a tiny drip ran down her thumb. She laughed, a soft musical sound that mixed with the crash of the waves. "Jason used to eat these so fast he'd get brain freeze," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Remember how he'd dance around like a fool until it passed?" For a moment, I wondered if she was mixing up timelines again, but then she looked at me with sharp, focused eyes. "You were always the careful one, Audrey, sitting right here watching everything." I felt my throat tighten. She remembered. Even on days when she called Richard by my grandfather's name or forgot what year it was, she still held onto these small, precious details about me. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the rhythmic roar of the ocean. Waves rolled in foaming white against the dark sand, pulling back with a hiss that sounded like the earth itself breathing. Seagulls cried overhead, diving and wheeling in the salty wind. The air smelled of kelp and brine and distant rain. Evelyn's gaze drifted far out to the horizon, where the sky met the sea in a hazy blue line. "It's bigger than I remembered," she murmured. "Or maybe I'm just smaller now." She turned to me, her pale blue eyes reflecting the water. Thank you for not listening to them. They think because I forget things that I don't feel anymore. But I do. I feel everything. I wanted to tell her how much those words meant, how they eased the constant ache of watching her slip away piece by piece. Instead, I simply rested my head gently against her shoulder like I did when I was small. Her cardigan smelled of home lavender soap, old books, and the faint trace of the peppermints she loved. We stayed like that as the sun climbed higher, sharing the quiet companionship that had always been our special language. Later, a middle-aged man walking his golden retriever noticed us. He offered kindly to take a picture. Evelyn surprised both of us by asking if he could record a short video on my phone instead. Just for me, she said with that familiar spark of mischief I remembered from her younger days. Something to hold on to. The man smiled warmly and obliged, filming a gentle clip of us sitting together with the ocean behind us. When he handed the phone back, he gave me a meaningful look. She wanted this kept safe, he said quietly before continuing on his walk. Evelyn seemed satisfied. She asked me to play the video back once, watching it with a small private smile, then nodded as if something important had been settled. After that, her energy shifted again. She spoke of my grandfather recalling their honeymoon walk along this very stretch of beach in 1952. Her voice grew animated as she described how he had carried her across a tide pool so her shoes wouldn't get wet, how they had laughed until they cried when a wave soaked them both anyway. Then, without warning, she would drift, asking if my father was coming soon, or wondering why the house looked different. I didn't correct her. I simply held her hand and let her wander through the fragments of her life, anchoring her when she needed it. At one point, she grew quiet again, staring intently at the water. Minutes passed. The wind tugged at loose strands of her silver hair, and I tucked them gently behind her ear. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly, her voice low but perfectly lucid. "Choosing the army. Being away so much." I considered the question carefully, watching a pair of pelicans glide low over the breaking waves. Sometimes I admitted, especially when I miss moments like this. But it's who I am, Grandma, and it brought me here today, right where I need to be. She nodded slowly, seeming to absorb my words. You were always the strong one. Even when you were little and the storms scared you, you'd come sit with me instead of running to your parents. You faced things head on. Her fingers traced the edge of the blanket. I'm proud of you, my brave girl. Prouder than you know. Those words settled deep inside me, warming places that had grown cold during long nights in distant deserts and tense family dinners back home. We ate more ice cream. We watched children playing at the water's edge, their laughter carrying on the wind. Evelyn pointed out shapes in the clouds, an old sailboat, a dog, the face of someone she once knew. Time stretched and softened around us. The world narrowed to this bench, this ocean, this moment between us. As the afternoon light turned golden and the shadows grew longer, Evelyn grew still once more. She gazed out at the vast expanse of water with an expression of profound peace. The wind had died down to a gentle caress. I could see the rise and fall of her chest, steady and calm. After a long while, she spoke again, her voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had reached the end of a long journey. Now I'm ready. I didn't ask what she meant. I simply nodded and squeezed her hand, letting the sound of the waves fill the space between us. We stayed until the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in strokes of orange and pink. Then I wheeled her back to the car, her head resting lightly against the seat, as exhaustion finally claimed her. The drive home was peaceful, the radio playing softly in the background. Evelyn slept most of the way, a small smile still lingering on her lips. I had no idea then how deeply that single day had imprinted itself, not just on her fading memory, but on everything that was about to unfold. All I knew was that for a few precious hours, my grandmother had been truly present with me by the ocean she loved, and that was enough. The weeks that followed the trip to the ocean settled into a heavy, watchful quiet. Evelyn's health began to decline more noticeably, like a tide slowly pulling away from the shore. She moved slower, her once steady hands trembling when she tried to hold a teacup. Her naps grew longer, And there were more days when she stayed in bed staring at the faded floral wallpaper of her bedroom, as if searching for something just out of reach. The house itself seemed to age along with her, the creak of the floorboards louder, the dust thicker in the corners, the roses outside losing their fight against the weeds. Richard came by less and less. He would call ahead, his voice brisk over the phone. "Work is crazy right now, Mom. Big project closing next week. I'll swing by when things calm down." But the weeks turned into months, and the calm never arrived. I watched from the doorway during my own short leaves how he would stand in the living room checking his watch, offering quick hugs and promises that felt as thin as the hospital sheets we sometimes had to change. Linda would bustle around making tea no one drank, filling the silence with chatter about the grandkids or the latest neighborhood news. Jason visited even less, sending expensive flower arrangements with cards that read, "Thinking of you," in someone else's handwriting. I found myself caught in the middle as always. Between deployments, I drove up whenever I could, sleeping on the old couch in Evelyn's living room, so I could be there if she woke confused in the night. The Army had taught me discipline and endurance, but nothing prepared me for the slow heartbreak of watching someone you love disappear while still sitting right in front of you. I would read to her from her favorite worn novels, my voice steady, even when hers wandered. I brought her favorite foods, chicken soup with extra carrots the way she liked it, and helped her eat when her hands shook too much. In the garden, I pushed her wheelchair along the uneven paths while she pointed out flowers she could still name on her good days. "You're too good to me, Audrey," she would say, patting my arm. "My brave girl. Always have been." Those words became a lifeline. On the bad days when she didn't recognize the house or asked repeatedly where her husband was, I held on to them. The family arguments started quietly at first, then grew sharper around the edges. It began with discussions about the future practical things they called them. Richard pushed hard for moving her to a nursing home. "It's the responsible thing," he argued one evening over dinner at the house, his fork stabbing at a piece of pot roast. "She needs professional care 24/7. We can't keep doing this." Linda nodded along, though her eyes flicked nervously toward me. "The house is getting too much for her. And the upkeep. It's a lot." Jason stayed quiet, scrolling on his phone, but I could see the calculations running behind his eyes. The old craftsman house sat on valuable land now. Property values had soared in the area. I knew what this was really about. Money, security. The kind of security that came from selling pieces of the past rather than protecting them. I set my glass down harder than I meant to. She wants to stay here, in her home, with her memories. Richard sighed, the same exasperated sound he had made the day I took her to the ocean. "She won't even remember this place soon, Audrey. You're making this harder than it has to be," always the idealist. The tension hung thick in the air, heavier than the scent of cooling roast and overcooked green beans. I bit back sharper words, knowing they wouldn't help Evelyn. Instead, I focused on the small things that still brought her joy, brushing her hair, until it shone like silver thread, playing old records on the ancient player in the corner, sitting with her on the porch, as the evening light faded and the neighborhood quieted. One particular night stands out in my memory. It was late autumn, the kind of evening where the rain tapped insistently against the windows and the house felt smaller, more fragile. Evelyn had been restless all day, her mind flickering between lucidity and confusion like a candle in a draft. I sat beside her bed, holding her hand, as I had done so many times. Her skin felt paper-thin cool despite the heavy quilt I had tucked around her. She gripped my fingers suddenly, her eyes clearing with surprising focus. "Audrey," she whispered, her voice urgent, "promise me." I leaned closer, my heart beating faster. "What is it, Grandma? I'm here. Tell me." Her lips moved, shaping words that seemed to cost her great effort. "Promise me you'll—" But the sentence trailed off. Her eyelids grew heavy, and within moments she had slipped into sleep, her breathing evening, out into the soft rhythm I had come to know so well. I stayed there long after, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest, wondering what she had wanted to say, what promise she needed from me before time ran out. The silent months stretched on. Richard's visits remained perfunctory, always tied to lawyer meetings about the estate or questions about her accounts. I overheard him once in the hallway speaking to the attorney in hushed tones about power of attorney and selling the house after the inevitable. The words landed like stones in my stomach. Evelyn, meanwhile, continued to fade in small, heartbreaking increments. Yet, on the days when clarity returned, she would look at me and smile with such love that it took my breath away. "You came back again," she would say. "My brave girl." I carried those moments with me when I had to return to duty, tucking them away like precious photographs. The family continued its slow, unraveling arguments over money, over care, over what Evelyn would have wanted. But through it all, I kept showing up. Not out of obligation, but because she had once shown up for me when no one else did. Because love I was learning wasn't always loud or convenient. Sometimes it was simply being there day after quiet day, while the world outside kept spinning. Little did I know that Evelyn was holding on to far more than any of us realized. That beneath the confusion and the forgetting, her heart had been keeping perfect, painful records of everything. Winter arrived with a quiet cruelty that year, bringing cold rains that seeped into the bones of the old house and into all of us. Evelyn grew frailer by the week, her world shrinking to the four walls of her bedroom and the view of the garden from her window. I extended my leave as long as the army would allow, sleeping in fits and starts on the couch, waking at every small sound from her room. The family's arguments had quieted into a tense, watchful waiting. No one said it out loud, but we all knew the end was coming. It happened on a Tuesday morning just after dawn. I had been reading to her from one of her old poetry books the night before Frost and Dickinson, the words flowing soft in the lamplight. She had listened with her eyes half closed, a peaceful expression on her face. When I checked on her at first light, her hand was cool in mine. She had slipped away gently in her sleep, a small, almost relieved smile still touching her lips. The house felt instantly emptier, as if the soul of it had departed with her. The days that followed blurred into a painful rhythm of arrangements. Richard stepped forward immediately, taking charge with the efficiency of a man closing a business deal. He chose the funeral home, selected the casket, a polished oak with brass handles that looked far too heavy for the woman who had lived so lightly in her final years. "We'll do this right," he announced at the kitchen table, spreading out brochures and paperwork. "People need to see that the Coopers take care of their own." His voice carried that familiar note of performance, the one he used at client dinners and charity galas. Linda nodded supportively, though her eyes were red-rimmed from quiet crying in the bathroom when she thought no one could hear. Jason handled the obituary and the guest list, adding names of distant relatives and business associates who barely knew Evelyn. I moved through it all like a shadow, speaking little. The grief sat heavy in my chest, a constant ache that sharpened at unexpected moments the sight of her favorite teacup in the sink, the lavender scent lingering on her pillow, the empty wheelchair folded in the corner. I spent hours sorting through her things, folding her cardigans, running my fingers over the pages of her old journals. Each small task felt like both goodbye and preservation. The funeral home smelled of lilies and polished wood, an artificial calm that did little to soothe the storm inside me. On the morning of the viewing, I stood in the preparation room in my dress uniform, staring at the woman in the casket, who looked both like my grandmother and somehow not. The mortician had done gentle work, but nothing could restore the spark that had made her Evelyn. Richard adjusted the floral arrangements with precise movements, stepping back to admire his work. "She looks dignified," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "This is how people will remember her, as part of a family that honored her." I said nothing. My throat felt too tight for words. Instead, I placed a single sprig of lavender from her garden into her hands, the way she had always loved it. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of arriving guests. That was when the lawyer appeared. Mr. Harlan had been Evelyn's attorney for decades, a quiet, bespectacled man in his late 60s who had always treated her with old-fashioned respect. He entered the preparation room carrying a slim leather portfolio, his expression solemn. Richard looked up surprised, but quickly recovering his composure. "Harlan, good of you to come. We'll handle the will reading after the service, of course." The lawyer cleared his throat. Actually, Richard, Evelyn left one final request. She was quite specific about the timing. He glanced around the room, his eyes meeting mine for a brief moment. She wanted this played here before the service begins. For the family. Richard frowned, adjusting his tie. What is this about? We have a program planned. Eulogies the minister. It was her explicit wish, Mr. Harlan said firmly, setting up a small portable screen and speaker on a side table. She recorded it some time ago and trusted me to ensure it was shown at this moment. A strange tension filled the room. Linda twisted her hands together. Jason put away his phone. I stood perfectly still, my heart beginning to beat harder against my ribs. We had all assumed this would be about the will distributions of property, perhaps a few sentimental items. No one expected anything more. Mr. Harlan pressed play. The screen flickered to life, and there she was, Evelyn, sitting on that familiar bench by the ocean, the wind gently moving her hair. It was the video from our day together. But as the footage continued, I realized with a jolt that this was not the same clip I had seen. The camera angle shifted closer to her face. She looked directly into the lens with startling clarity, her eyes bright and focused in a way I hadn't seen in many months. No confusion clouded her expression. Only calm certainty. If you're watching this, she began, her voice steady and strong. The room went completely still. Richard's face began to change, the color slowly draining from it as the implications sank in. Whatever came next, I could feel in my bones that nothing in our family would ever be the same. The video continued, and Evelyn's voice filled the quiet preparation room like a living presence. On the screen, she sat straight-backed on the ocean bench, the waves rolling behind her with their eternal rhythm. Her eyes, those pale blue eyes that had once been sharp as winter sky, held the camera with unwavering focus. This was not the Evelyn of the foggy afternoons or the wandering sentences. This was my grandmother, as she had been in her prime, clear, dignified, and full of quiet power. If you're watching this, she said, her voice carrying the gentle lilt of someone who had rehearsed these words carefully, then I have already gone home to be with my dear Thomas. And you, my family, have gathered to say goodbye. But before you do, there are things I need you to hear. Things I never forgot. Richard shifted uncomfortably beside me, his face pale. A thin sheen of sweat had broken out on his forehead. Linda's hand flew to her mouth. Jason stood, frozen phone forgotten in his pocket. Evelyn began addressing each of us by name, her memory razor sharp. She spoke of Linda's habit of bringing yellow roses every spring because they had been her favorites at her wedding. She recalled the exact date Jason had graduated college and how proud she had been when he landed his first big job. She remembered small kindnesses and larger ones, dates and details that none of us had expected her to keep. The room was deathly silent except for her voice and the distant sound of the ocean. Then her expression grew more solemn as she turned her attention to Richard. "Richard, my son," she said softly. "You were always so busy building your empire. I understood that. A man needs purpose. But there were so many times when I waited for you. I waited on the porch on Sundays, hoping you would come sit with me like you did when you were a boy. Instead, I heard you in the hallway telling the nurses, 'Mom won't know anyway. Just make her comfortable.' You said it more than once. You thought the forgetting went both ways, that if my mind slipped, so did my heart." Richard made a small, choked sound. His hands clenched at his sides. I could see the muscle jumping in his jaw, the way his eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape. The color had drained completely from his face, leaving him ashen against his dark suit. Evelyn continued without mercy, though her tone remained loving, almost sorrowful. She listed specific moments with devastating precision, the afternoon he had canceled a promised visit because of a golf game with clients. The Thanksgiving when he had stepped outside to take business calls for nearly 2 hours while she sat at the table growing tired. The way he had pushed for the nursing home, not out of concern for her comfort, but for convenience. Every detail landed like a quiet hammer blow. The entire room had gone still. Distant relatives and friends who had begun to filter in for the viewing stood in the doorway, uncertain whether to enter or retreat. No one moved. The air felt thick, charged with the kind of truth that rearranges everything it touches. I felt tears burning in my eyes, but they were not only from grief. There was something else, validation perhaps, or the ache of watching years of quiet neglect laid bare. Evelyn had seen everything. Even when her words failed her in the moment, her heart had been keeping perfect score. Then her voice softened as she spoke directly to me. "Audrey, my brave girl. You never failed me. Not once. You drove through storms and gave up precious leave to sit with an old woman who sometimes didn't even know what day it was. You brought me soup when I couldn't taste it. You read to me until your voice grew hoarse. You took me to the ocean when everyone else said it was pointless." She smiled then, a radiant, loving smile that seemed to reach across time itself. "You showed me what real devotion looks like. I remember every single visit, every hour, every mile you drove just to hold my hand." Tears slipped down my cheeks, now warm and silent. I didn't bother wiping them away. In that moment, standing in the funeral home surrounded by lilies and polished wood, I felt seen in a way I had never experienced before. All the lonely nights, all the deployments, all the times I had chosen duty to family over duty to career, they had mattered. Evelyn paused on the screen, looking directly at all of us. People think that when the mind starts to go, the love goes with it. But love doesn't forget. It remembers in the quiet ways, in the way a hand feels in yours, in the sound of a familiar voice, in the knowledge of who showed up when no one was watching. Richard was openly crying now, though he tried to hide it by turning away. His shoulders shook with silent sobs. The powerful man who had built a career on control had been completely undone by the gentle truth of his own mother. Linda reached for his arm, but he shrugged her off, lost in his private reckoning. The video ended with Evelyn looking straight into the camera one final time. "I love you all. Even in my forgetting, I loved you. Now go and remember what matters before it's too late." The screen went dark. For several long seconds no one spoke. The weight of her words hung in the air like sea salt after a storm. Richard stood motionless, staring at the blank screen, as if willing it to take back everything it had shown. I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and release washing over me. My grandmother had not been lost to us in the way we had all believed. She had been present, watching, remembering, loving until the very end. Mr. Harlan cleared his throat quietly. "There is more," he said, "but perhaps we should proceed with the service first." No one argued. The truth had already done its work. The service itself passed in a haze of hymns and carefully worded eulogies that now rang hollow after Evelyn's video. Richard stood at the podium and spoke of his mother's strength and grace, his voice cracking at moments in ways that might have moved the congregation if we hadn't all just witnessed the raw truth in that preparation room. I sat in the front pew, hands folded in my lap, feeling the weight of every eye that kept glancing our way. The family secret had been laid bare, and there was no putting it back in the box. After the burial, when most of the guests had offered their condolences and drifted away into the gray afternoon, Mr. Harlan gathered the immediate family in a small private room at the funeral home. The space smelled of fresh coffee and old grief. Richard sat heavily in one of the upholstered chairs, his tie-loosened, eyes red-rimmed. Linda hovered near him, uncertain. Jason leaned against the wall, arms crossed, looking younger than his 41 years. "There is more to Evelyn's final message," Mr. Harlan said, queuing up another segment of the video. "She asked that this part be shown only to the four of you." The screen flickered back to life. Evelyn appeared again, still seated on the ocean bench, but the light had shifted to a softer, later hour. Her expression was calm, almost tender, as if she were speaking to us from beyond the veil with nothing left to lose. "I want you to understand something important," she began. "I was not completely lost in the fog. There were windows, clear, beautiful windows where everything came back to me. I knew who came to visit and who stayed away. I knew who called the lawyer and who called me. I knew who saw me as a burden and who saw me as their grandmother." She listed them with gentle but unflinching honesty. She spoke of the times Richard had come only when documents needed signing, checking his watch, while she tried to share memories. She recalled Jason's quick visits that felt more like obligations than love. She even mentioned Linda's kindnesses, the small comforts she had offered, giving her daughter-in-law credit where it was due. But it was when she turned to me again that her voice warmed like sunlight breaking through clouds. Audrey came when she could. She drove for hours on her precious leave. She brought me soup and sat with me through the nights when the confusion was worst. She pushed my chair through the garden and listened to the same stories over and over without complaint. She took me to the ocean when everyone else said it was pointless. Evelyn's eyes glistened with unshed tears on the screen. She loved me when nobody was watching. That is the rarest kind of love. Richard broke then. A deep, guttural sob escaped him as he buried his face in his hands. The successful developer, the man who always had the answers, and the next deal crumbled under the weight of his mother's final testimony. "I didn't know," he whispered hoarsely. I thought she didn't understand anymore. I told myself it was kinder not to burden her with my presence when she wouldn't remember. But Evelyn's voice continued from the screen as if answering him directly. "People think old age erases love. It doesn't. It distills it. It makes clear what was always there. I forgave you long ago, Richard. But forgiveness doesn't erase the loneliness. I hope you learn from this before it's too late for your own children." The video ended on her gentle smile, the ocean waves continuing their steady rhythm behind her. The room was silent except for Richard's quiet weeping. I felt an overwhelming mixture of emotions, grief, relief, and a strange kind of peace. My grandmother had not been diminished by her illness. She had been greater than any of us realized, holding on to her dignity and her love until the very end. Mr. Harlan reached into his portfolio and withdrew a thick manila envelope sealed with Evelyn's familiar handwriting across the front. "This is for all of you, but especially for Audrey. She left specific instructions." He handed the envelope to me. My fingers trembled slightly as I accepted it. Inside I could feel the weight of papers, perhaps letters, and something smaller, more precious. Richard looked up, his face ravaged by regret. "Whatever is in there," he said, his voice rough, "it's yours, Audrey. You earned it. I failed her. I see that now. All the money, the house, the assets, none of it matters. I lost the chance to be her son when she needed me most, and I can't get that back." For the first time in years, I saw genuine remorse in my father's eyes. Not the calculated sorrow he showed clients, but real, human pain. Linda reached for his hand, and this time he let her. Jason looked away, swallowing hard, perhaps seeing his own absences reflected in his father's breakdown. I held the envelope close to my chest, feeling the last tangible connection to my grandmother. She had planned everything with such care, the video, the timing, the final words. Even in her final months, she had been protecting what mattered most, the truth. The truth she had never forgotten. The manila envelope felt both heavy and impossibly light in my hands as I sat alone in the quiet of Evelyn's living room later that evening. The rest of the family had gone home carrying their own private reckonings. Richard had barely spoken after the video, his usual commanding presence reduced to a shadow of a man confronting the cost of years of convenient neglect. For the first time, I saw him not as my distant, driven father, but simply as a son who had run out of time to make things right. Inside the envelope were treasures more valuable than any property or bank account. There were handwritten letters addressed to each of us, but the thickest bundle was for me. Evelyn's elegant, slightly shaky script covered page after page, memories of my childhood words of pride, in my service, gentle guidance for the years ahead. There was another short video file on a thumb drive recorded privately, and a small velvet box containing her wedding ring. The simple gold band, worn thin after decades of love and labor, caught the lamplight as I lifted it. Tucked alongside were her precious family album and the worn leather journal she had kept for over 60 years. None of it was about money. In her final instructions, written with perfect clarity, Evelyn had made that clear. She left the house and most of the financial assets to be divided among the family, but these personal items, the heart of her life, she entrusted to me. Because Audrey loved me when nobody was watching the note read. She showed up. She stayed. She remembered me even when I couldn't always remember myself. Tears fell freely onto the pages as I read. I could hear her voice in every word, that gentle strength that had guided me through so many difficult years. She had known. Through all the foggy days and confused nights, she had known who truly cared. Richard came by the house the next morning. He looked older, somehow smaller, as he stood in the doorway. I was wrong about so many things he said quietly, not just with Mom. With you too, Audrey. I pushed you away because you reminded me of what I wasn't doing. I'm sorry, I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I needed to say it. I nodded, the anger I might have felt once softened by the weight of Evelyn's grace. She forgave you, Dad. Maybe that's where we start. He didn't stay long. There were no grand reconciliations or easy fixes. Just the beginning of something honest and painful. I watched him leave, then gathered the things Evelyn had left me. I folded the American flag that had draped her casket and placed it carefully in the box with her journal album and letters. Then I drove. The coastal highway felt familiar now, every curve etched into memory from that single precious trip. I parked in the same spot and walked the path to the bench where we had sat together. The ocean stretched out endlessly, the waves rolling in with their ancient, steady rhythm. I sat down exactly where she had been, the salt air filling my lungs, the cry of gulls overhead. I opened the final letter she had saved for this moment. It was short, just one sentence written in her hand. The ocean remembered us, just like I always remembered you. A smile broke through my tears. I sat there for a long time, holding her words close as the sun moved across the sky. The grief was still there, sharp and real, but so was something deeper, a sense of completion. Evelyn had given me one final gift, the knowledge that love, real love, endures. It remembers. It shows up. And sometimes it waits until the very end to speak its truth. I stood, eventually brushing the sand from my uniform, and looked out at the Pacific one last time. The waves kept coming just as they always had, just as they always would. If this story touched you, I'd love to know how it landed. Have you ever had a moment where someone's quiet love surprised you, or a family truth came to light when you least expected it? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and tell me where you're watching from. Stories like Evelyn and Audrey's remind us what really matters in this life. If you'd like more heartfelt family dramas with real emotion and hard-won redemption, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have many more journeys waiting to be shared. Let's keep remembering what matters together.